New Orleans, Louisiana will always be a city that I love. The architecture, the history, the pralines, Cafe du Mond's beignets, I literally can't get enough. But as beautiful and rich in history as the city is, it's had its share of tragedies, a lot of which center around hurricanes and the devastation that they can leave in their path. Lying below sea level, New Orleans is hit quite hard when the sea becomes very angry, and is known as the unshakable city. However, a hurricane, a troubled veteran, and a young poet would mix together for a huge blow that would shake the city and leave us talking about the devastation for years to come. October 17th, 2006 would start with what seemed to be one person ending their life, but would end with police finding one of the most gruesome murder scenes they have ever seen over a voodoo priestess's temple, which just stirred all kinds of chatter and rumors. Today we are discussing the case of Zack Bowen and Addie Hall, which I will warn you is one of the more disturbing cases I have ever heard, both because of the violence committed and the thought of the mental struggles going through the perpetrator's head. My name is Misty Sims, and this is Beyond Reasonable Doubt. Let's dive right on in. Zack Bowen was born in Bakersfield, California on May 15, 1978, to parents Jack and Lori, who were described as having hippie spirits. When Zack was only 3 months old, they decided to live their life on the road. They packed up Zack and his older brother, who was 3 years old at the time, and sat out in a Volkswagen van and traveled around from town to town where they had friends. They fell in love with the area of Puget Sound, just a little north of Seattle, and they stayed there for a little while, but after about 5 years, their marriage was suffering. Jack wasn't coming home in the evenings and was staying out until all hours drinking with his friends, and Lori had just had enough. She decided to file for divorce and took the kids and moved to Santa Maria, California, leaving Jack behind in Washington State. Now, he would only see his kids sporadically, and as Zack was entering his teen years, he was very awkward. He was over 6 foot tall in stature with a size 17 shoe. But he did seem to enjoy being the class clown and was popular amongst his peers despite feeling awkward about his size. But unfortunately, he would experience what he felt like was an extremely embarrassing incident by losing out on Homecoming King. So he made the decision to go live with his father. And Jack was happy to have him, but of course his mom was very worried. She saw that Jack saw his son as more of a buddy than a parent, like child relationship. So she was reluctant, but she let him go, and Jack planned a huge road trip for them to just live it up a little. And they ended up traveling to New Orleans, and rather than going back to Washington as planned, they ended up fulfilling more of that free spirit persona that he had, that Jack had, and just got an apartment and stayed there. So Zack enrolled in school, but still felt pretty awkward and isolated, and he eventually just dropped out. But now he was starting to grow into his height, and he had dimples and a pretty handsome face. So when he would go out drinking in the quarter, he attracted males and females alike. And he quickly found a job in the service industry, working at one of the to-go cup windows. And this is where he would meet 28-year-old Lana Shupak, a dancer who was visiting New Orleans from Dallas. Now, Zack was only 18 at the time, but he and Lana were smitten with each other. He called her after she and her friend were at the bar and asked to take shots with him. And of course, they happily obliged. Lana was from a strict Jewish family, but had adopted a rebellious lifestyle and hit the road partying and dancing to make money. She had a pretty volatile marriage in her early 20s and had just recently moved to Dallas. And she met Zack the first night of her trip to New Orleans with her friend. When she went back to Dallas, Zack called her repeatedly, begging her to return, and soon she did. And by the end of 1996, Lana found out he was only 18, and even though it freaked her out a little bit, she was also especially freaked out because she was pregnant. And she didn't want to tell him, but she did go ahead and tell him so he could make a decision on whether he wanted to be involved or not. She basically told him there was no, push to, and she didn't even tell him that his son was born until a week later. But even at 18, Zack took on the responsibility and rushed over and fell in love with the little baby boy when he met him. So Lana decided to give it a go with their relationship. Zack would help take care of Jackson, and he worked 2 bar jobs to bring money into the home. And, he was just a kid, so he would go hang out, with his bar buddies after his shift, and that ended up getting him arrested after one of his friends was busted for drug paraphernalia. Well, Zack saw this as a sign that he needed to buckle down and work even harder, and even convinced Lana to marry him, citing that it was just for health insurance benefits, but he did love her. And they were married in Jackson Square in New Orleans in a beautiful ceremony full of emotion, and, partly because it was so beautiful, and then the other part was because they had recently found out they were actually expecting a second child, a baby girl. And after she was born, Zack made a decision that he needed to join the military, much like his brother had. So he got his GED and enlisted in the Army for 8 years, hoping that this would be a better life for the family with a lot of stability. And he didn't want Lana to have to go back to dancing. And, there was no war going on, so why not, right? So in June of 2000, Zack began his basic training in Missouri. He had a fairly smooth transition into the military and was really hopeful for the future. And he found out in October of 2000 that he was being deployed into Germany, which was what he had requested, was to go to Europe. So he was responsible for patrolling the base perimeter and stalking the commissary, and his fellow soldiers just loved him. And he bonded with a group of English-speaking locals, so just tons of fun for him. But by 2001 in January, he found himself deployed to Kosovo on a peacekeeping mission. And when he arrived, things were fairly peaceful, and he worked and led his friends in, sing-alongs. But his company was soon tagged with a mission that had him in a little bit more confrontational situations with Serbian opposition. And Zack, with his kind spirit, he befriended an Albanian girl who he was giving candy one day while on patrol, only to find out the next day that she had been killed for accepting a gift and talking to an American. And this kind of crushed his spirit, and he was already worried about Lana and the kids back in New Orleans. And he was a little angry at her because she hadn't done the paperwork that she needed to do in order for her and the kids to move over to Germany with him. And around the same time, he was needing surgery because if you recall, I said his shoes were size 17, his feet were. Well, the combat boots didn't exactly fit that very well and were causing a severe case of hammer toe. So, he was looking at this kind of as a positive that he could go back to New Orleans, get his surgery, and then work on his marriage with Lana. And while he was there, he filled out the paperwork to have them move over to the military base with him. Now, Lana struggled to adjust at first because Zack had shared photos of her dancing with his fellow soldiers, kind of bragging on his hot wife. And the soldiers accepted her, but their wives did not. So she was very alone and isolated during her initial time there. She finally was able to break down that barrier and make a friend. And that opened up their home, to more cookouts and friends and starting to feel part of the community. But as we all know, September the 11th, 2001 changed the entire world in the blink of an eye. Zack and Lana were sitting in front of their TV watching it when the first plane hit the towers. And Lana described herself as terrified from that moment on because she knew, oh no, Zack's on active duty. What's going to happen? Well, he immediately shipped out to Kuwait. The conditions were terrible there, sandstorms, wearing gas masks all the time, and the troops were starting to form small groups who thought that, they were kind of rebels and thought that this was just kind of a conspiracy. They were being used as a piece and as a pawn in a political strategy. I'll get that on in a minute. And that there were no weapons of mass destruction and all these types of things that they were being told. Meanwhile, they're facing, enemy fire. They're having a hard time telling civilians from enemies. There's shortages on supplies. It was just a rough time. And his group ended up moving on into Baghdad, where they were supposed to be training the Iraqi police force. And, this should have been a good thing, right? And morale was starting to improve because they were also going to be building things like schools back while they were there. But that was short-lived because there's tons of corruption in the police force. Around that time, I think Saddam emptied the prison, so prisoners were intermingling with civilians. Zack is back suffering with his hammer toe because that surgery didn't work. So just a lot of pressure and pain points going on while he was there. Now, he was able to keep the peace where he was directly stationed, which was in a palace, and he was working 14, 18-hour days. And he just kind of felt embarrassed over his position. He saw himself as the back office bitch. So kind of demoralizing for where he was. But thankfully, he received a promotion quickly, and that helped a little bit. But his hopes and dreams and joy would be dashed when Lana was diagnosed with hepatitis C and needed medical intervention almost immediately. Well, of course, Zack, he went home to take care of her, but the Army said, no, we need you back. You've got to come back to Iraq. And even with her doctors and the Red Cross pleading his case, they denied the fact that he could stay longer and take care of her. And that really soured Zack on the military and his whole discontent for the Army at that time. And it did not help that one of his very good friends named Rachel Boswell was killed by a mortar attack. And that loss, it hit him hard. Not only were they close, but she and Zack would entertain the troops together. She's a tattoo artist. They just had a lot in common. So he just really grieved his friend. And unfortunately, the misfortune did not stop coming. So Zack had kind of adopted this Iraqi boy named Rashid. It was a very sweet relationship. The little boy's family owned a store across from the police station, and he would bring Zack canned Cokes and ice during the day, and Zack would teach him English. Well, one day in September, insurgents blew up the store, and it killed Rashid and his entire family, assumingly because they were helping the Americans. So all this, Lana's sickness, Rachel's death, it just put Zack into a very deep depression. He rarely left the palace until he was finally allowed to go back to Germany. And when he did return, Lana said he was never the same. He was cold, he was withdrawn, he was bitter. She was fearful that their relationship was falling apart, even though he would, claim it wasn't. He's looking forward to the future. And what no one knew was on the inside, Zack was still just so angry and resentful over the war. And it only grew when the announcement came out from intelligence in January of 2004 that there were no weapons of mass destruction to be found in Iraq, and kind of solidified Zack's position that the war was just a joke, in his words. And he is respiring mentally, and then physically he starts to spiral as well. He's having frequent headaches, shortness of breath, both of which we now know to be early indicators of PTSD. His feet were hurting, his back was hurting, he had a rash he couldn't get rid of, and then, like I said, he's got the grief for Rashid, he's got the grief for Rachel, and he just hit his limit. He decided if the Army wouldn't let him go, then he was going to get himself out by failing his PT test, or his physical capability test. So he started saying that he could not do the required amount of sit-ups. Now, Lana knew this was happening, but she didn't know it was intentional, but she did say he seemed very angry and secretive at the time. And by the fall of 2004, he was discharged from the military due to unsatisfactory performance in this PT test. Now, his commanding officer recommended an honorable discharge, but a superior overruled that and gave him just a general discharge, which is a huge deal because soldiers can lose a lot of their benefits like life insurance, disability, and home loan guarantees through that type of discharge. It can also make finding a civilian job really hard. And Zack had kept all that from Lana. So the day he came home and just announced, like, hey, I'm out of the military, she's angry because the military life was supposed to be for the better of them so that she didn't have to dance, aka strip, anymore. And he wouldn't just have to bartend. And he was just throwing it all away in her eyes and ready just to go back to New Orleans with nothing. So she told him, you know what? I'm done. You watch the kids for a little bit. I'm going to hop a plane back to New Orleans and I'm going to go find myself a place to live and a job. Now, Zack was humiliated by this and losing his wife, being discharged by the Army. And looking back on it now, Army lawyers say that there was no reason for this general discharge. Hindsight's 20/20, right? But at the time, it crushed him, and his family's falling apart. He felt like he ruined his entire future. So when Lana picked he and the kids up from the airport in December of 2004, he took another blow because she told him she had started seeing someone else. So the kids lived with Lana, and Zack stayed in a hotel for a little while, but seeing how bad off he was and miserable, Lana said, I'll get one apartment in Tarrytown, which is a suburb of New Orleans. This will hopefully help you out and make the kids happy, but we're not reconciling. Now, Zack had a little hope deep down, but, Lana was firm. So he started looking around trying to find a job, but it was extremely hard. Tourism was booming, and the service industry was highly competitive. So ultimately, he just stayed home and helped with the kids while she was working to support them until he finally found a job at Hogg's Bar, which was a little local dive bar. He got the graveyard shift, but it wasn't all bad because a lot of the dancers, when they would get off work at the club, they would come there and drink. And Zack started attracting suitors with his good looks. But he only had eyes for one, which is a girl that went by the name of Addie. Her full name was Adrienne Hall, and she was a 29-year-old dancer who was a short little spitfire with dirty blonde hair, and Zack was just drawn to her. She had that bohemian personality that he loved. And finally, in the spring of 2005, he had worn her down. They started sharing drinks together, talking about her life. He found out she was from Durham, North Carolina, where she was raised by a Vietnam veteran and a stay-at-home mom. And she had dropped out of high school to pursue her love of poetry and dancing, and kind of wandered all over the country before she settled into New Orleans, where she absolutely flourished with its kind of artistic and alternative lifestyles. And she was super creative and exuberant. But Addie did have a bad temper and a cocaine habit. She was known for lashing out into what they called dark spells when she was under the influence. And she was also very drawn to abusive and violent partners, which, increased her violent outbursts and the fights that she had in the New Orleans bar scene. She had a friend that she called Caps, who soon she began dating after she met him. And he recognized that her behavior was based on some type of abuse that he thought she had endured. And she finally confessed that she had been severely sexually abused as a child. Now, they became just friends after this because he didn't think he could date someone quite so damaged, but he did want to help her. But Addie eventually shut him off and just cut him off with the friendship when she found out he was dating someone else. Later in 2005, around August, Caps bumped into Addie, and she had Zack with her. And Caps said he could tell that Zack absolutely adored Addie, but kind of figured it would fizzle out soon, based on Addie's outbursts. But just a few days after this meeting, everyone's world would be flipped on its head when Hurricane Katrina was headed straight for New Orleans. It was about to take a direct hit. Now, the mayor of New Orleans, he urged the residents to leave, but didn't make it mandatory. Well, this freaked out Lana, as it would anybody, and she's getting the kids ready, and she calls Zach. She's like, "What are we going to do?" And he's like, "Nothing. I'm staying right here with Addie." Oh, Lana was mad. Like, why wouldn't he leave with her and the kids? Now, she wasn't jealous of Addie because she thought Addie really did care about Zack and was happy he had found somebody. So she's like, then pack her up and bring her too. But Zack refused. He said he wasn't going anywhere. And Lana was hurt. She was baffled by the fact that Zack didn't want to leave to be with his kids and keep everybody safe. So she kind of hunkered down and got her apartment ready so her and the kids would be safe. And by the next day, the mayor ordered a mandatory evacuation, but it was too little too late by that point. There were thousands of cars on the interstates, like just jammed up trying to get out everywhere. A lot of people didn't have a way out, so they just had to hunker down and prepare for the hit. And, Zack and Addie, they supplied her apartment with supplies, but it was liquor and ice from the bar that Zack was working at. By August 29th, Katrina made landfall with winds reaching 175 miles per hour. The levees began breaking, floods started, there were widespread power outages everywhere, so most people, even if they made it through it, had no idea what was going on around them, except that they could see families outside walking with literally all they could carry in their hands trying to escape the flooding. Now, the devastation was heartbreaking. And there's a lot of acknowledged failures that just worsened the situation. I can remember scenes on the news like it was yesterday, and it looked like a bad dream that you just couldn't wake up from. It was horrible. And the final death toll, I believe, was 1,186 people, with over 700 people missing that were never found. It caused over $150 billion in devastation for the state and the city. The French Quarter was like the only place that wasn't underwater, and that's where Zack and Addie were. And they weren't leaving and kind of got swept up in the whole survivalist mode thing. They'd clear streets in the day, and then they'd serve the liquor and the drinks at night with campfire meals of canned beans to people. And they just kind of fell further in love with each other. And as they worked harder and became, deeper in the survivalist life, they met a man named Jack Jones who had a fancy condo, and he had stocked up on water, had a big grill, big generous heart, so he's cooking for folks, and they got dubbed the tribes of the French Quarter and kind of became local celebrities, giving interviews to papers and all sorts of things like that. But this was short-lived when they were out gathering supplies one day when Addie was attacked and almost raped. And this sort of brought the realization of what was going on with them. It was like a delayed reaction to the storm and kind of broke Addie down. Now, Jack describes grilling out one night when there was a ton of these flies everywhere, and Addie just broke down in tears. And then another incident where Zack would hear, soldiers marching down the streets as they were coming to get kind of help people evacuate and check on the scene, and that triggered his PTSD. Now, evacuees started coming back. This kind of disrupted the survivalists and the people who didn't leave. The bliss was sort of over and the bubble was burst. As the city kind of went back to normal, the murder rate was increasing. There was a lot of racial tension. There was just a lot going on. And in Zach's personal life, Lana was demanding that he step back up and get his act together and help take care of his kids, because she had been held in a shelter and then taken to Texas during the evacuation, working for a waitress as a waitress in Applebee's, and he wasn't even returning her phone calls. She thought he was dead. And so when she gets back and finds out that he's A-okay and just been getting interviewed by the news, she's pissed off. And she's like, I need you to help with your children. Well, he agrees, and Addie seemed on board at first, but then all of a sudden she's like, nope, I don't want this. I don't want you seeing her. I don't want to be around her. And then finally they come to an agreement that the kids can visit bi-weekly, but Addie never really took to that, and Zach ended up having to rent hotel rooms for when the kids were there. And the kids were old enough to kind of realize what was going on, and they're like, Mom, Addie doesn't like us. That's why we're not allowed around when she's there. Their friends, Caps and Jack Jones, sort of saw this as like the beginning of the end for Zack and Addie. Like, if they couldn't have only each other, it just couldn't be peaceful, even with Zach's kids. But it kind of went on for a little while, kids would come over, Zach would get a hotel, that type of thing. Addie finally found a bartending job. Zach found a job as a bicycle deliverer for a local grocery store. And he kind of became a well-known figure in the French Quarter. Lana even noted that, there was a huge change and improvement in his attitude, because he kind of saw himself as like the king of the French Quarter. But post-Katrina, everyone was looking for an escape. And the service industry as a whole is just riddled with vices. So Zack and Addie were easily able to access drugs, and they would go on binges, drinking and drugging, and Addie would have more of her dark, abusive outbursts. And this started physical fights, one that included going on all night, but then blacking out during it. It got so bad, Zach ended up just leaving the city to go spend some time with his family in Portland. But this just triggered his grief, because he missed Addie so much. He told his family he missed his kids too. And, Lana's wanting him back in New Orleans because, she wants help with the kids. So he told his family he had to go back. And poor Addie is so in love with Zach. She's in a deep depression too and won't leave her apartment. So her friend Caps had called Zach and said, I'll buy your plane ticket just to come back. So he did. And their reunion was blissful, but it was brief, because it wouldn't last long before the fights and the drinking would start again. And the makeups and the breakups are happening regularly. And by August, they were drawing even like police attention, because Addie took off one night when they were mad with her handgun. And even though it wasn't loaded, someone still called the police, and she was arrested on this charge as well as drug-related charges when the police found marijuana during this search. Now, Zach refused to bail her out, but they got right back together after her friends bailed her out, so I don't know why he refused, but he did. And then on September 28th, they had another giant fight where Addie shoved him out of the apartment and locked him out, and he was just sitting on the front porch. The argument had gotten so loud, though, that the neighbors called the police. And then they found Zach trying to hide a bag of pot when they came to check on it, and so they arrested him. Well, Addie bailed him out 2 days later, and the fights and stuff started all over again, and it was getting really volatile at this point. So Zach started seeking comfort elsewhere. He was working and hanging out in gay bars regularly, and this was kind of to avoid Addie, but this soon led him to explore a relationship with a local male realtor. Or at least that's how he explained it to a mutual friend of his and Addie's named Squirrel, when Squirrel confronted him about his sexuality. Squirrel never told the secret, but the French Quarter is like a small town, and word spread like wildfire. And Addie was mad. Like, she picked up his phone, she called every woman in the phone and told them that Zach had AIDS, and then deleted their numbers. And she's using homophobic slurs at Zach. I mean, it was just a lot. And then she was also experiencing some financial problems, because she's spending all her money on the alcohol and the drugs, and had a falling out with her landlord, probably over late rent, but also over some plumbing. And she had to find somewhere else to go. Zach agreed to still help her and still hoped to reconcile with her. So on October 2nd, they found a place on North Rampart Street. It's a tiny little apartment over Miriam Sheminti's voodoo spiritual temple. And the couple had their first and last month's rent in cash, and they got the keys without even a lease. But the landlord said 2 days later, Addie would beg for a lease for 6 months in only her name. And Zack would call him 5 minutes later and say that now he was screwing him because he'd fronted the money for everything, so he didn't want that lease. It was just a mess. The landlord found him fighting in the stairwell with Addie yelling that Zack had cheated on her with a man. And the landlord kind of, backed out and didn't want to get involved in it, but Zack and Addie kept going at it for hours. And I don't think anybody realized how triggered Zack was by the thought of being left homeless. He had been homeless a ton while he was with Addie, sleeping in abandoned apartments and things like that. So this was a huge trigger for him. So on the night of October 4th, 2006, the fight kept going and turned physical. And sometime after midnight, he strangled Addie. And then he passed out drunk. As he states in a handwritten confession, he woke up sometime on October 5th and went to work. Yeah, went to his job. He ran into Caps, who said that Zack looked awful, and he told him that they had been fighting all night, and he and Addie were done, and she was going home to North Carolina. Now, Caps said it worried him, but he was like, surely, he didn't do anything to Addie, and she had said sometimes that, she was going to leave, even though Caps never thought she would. But Caps was wrong. In Zack's own written confession, which was grisly, he wrote how he had strangled her. And then he stopped referring to her as a person, as Addie. He continued on with the confession, saying that he had sexually defiled the body a few times, and then was posed with the question of how to dispose of the corpse. So Thursday night, he returned to his apartment after work, drug her to the bathroom. He got a saw, and he hacked off her head, hands, and feet, and put her head in the oven after giving it what he calls an awful haircut. He put her hands and feet in water on the stovetop. And he was then supposed to be off all weekend, so he had time, to work and figure out what he was going to do. But he admits that he spent most of that time in a bunch of bars, coked up with a bunch of different girls. Now, he woke up that Sunday, and he called Lana, and he offered her $600 to meet up with him and to be able to see his kids. He said he would get his apartment ready, kind of all fixed up and appropriate for children if the kids could come and spend the next weekend with him. Now, Lana was a little worried about what Addie would think, and Zack was like, don't worry about it, she won't even be there. And that, kind of left Lana a little bit confused, but the kids were so excited to finally be getting to spend some time with their dad that, she did what us moms do, and she agreed, and she was happy that they were happy. So Zack returns to the apartment, and he finished sawing off Addie's arms and legs, and he put them in roasting pans, put them in the oven, and then he said that he passed out for over 7 hours, and he was woken up by the awful smell coming from the kitchen. Now, he turned off the oven, and he went back to work that day, and he stated that this would be his last day that he would ever work. So his plans were Monday night after work, he would return home, and finally he would have it hit him what he had really done. And it would scare him, the lack of remorse that he was experiencing. So he decided to quit his job, and he was going to spend the last $1,500 that he had enjoying himself, and then he was going to take his own life. So for the next week, he did just that. He was drinking, he was doing cocaine, he's treating his friends to that same type of lifestyle. He getting lap dances, doing all these things, and he even went home with a stripper for a few days of fun. And then Zack said he ran into their mutual friend Squirrel, and Squirrel told him that he just didn't think it made sense how Addie just left because she loved New Orleans so much. And Squirrel says Zack just patted him on the back and said, "I'm going on vacation," and walked away. Now, in this drunken, fueled mess, Zack realizes it's October 10th, which was he and Lana's wedding anniversary, so he called her. Now, it was after midnight, and I'm sure, not many people are happy to hear from their exes drunk after midnight. So she's upset, and he's shouting at her to come have a drink with him, and shouting at her that she's still his wife. And then he offered her $400 to buy coats for the kids if she would come out with him. And when she still refused, He told her he wanted to party with his favorite stripper. That went over like a lead balloon. And she told him she was going to bed, and she hung up. So Zack spent the next couple of days partying with Caps, and then he also started doing things like readying for his final days, including putting 28 cigarette burns on his body, one for each year of his life, and then using Addie's journal to write out this full confession. And he finished it, and I'm summarizing here, that he had an effing good time in his final days, F it all, no regrets, which was a quote from the Metallica song Saint Anger that he also had tattooed on him. And he listed out all of his failures, including the military, marriage, and love. And to me, this just truly paints a picture of a very troubled man. Then on October 17th, 12 days after he took Addie's life, Zack went to see Squirrel, who wouldn't go out with him. So he grabbed a $20 bag of cocaine from Squirrel's dresser, walked to the Omni Royal, and spent the afternoon drinking by the pool. And then he jumped off the roof, where he was pronounced dead at the scene. When the police went to his apartment, the AC was set on 60, which kept the smell down, and after reading his confession in the notes, it explained why they didn't see very much blood. Zack hadn't dismembered Addie's body for over a day after he killed her, so there wasn't a whole lot of blood. And then he did it also in the bathtub, so that kind of helped with the mess. They noted that there were words just sprayed all over the apartment in spray paint, including, "I am a failure," "Please help me stop the pain," "Please call my wife," with Lana's number, and finally, "I love her," with an arrow pointing to the stovetop. Now, police did release a statement saying Zack must have had severe mental anguish to do this, but there was no sign of cannibalism, although the media is already running wild with that, saying that there was or could have been. Now, Lana was avoiding watching the news, but still had to call and tell Zack's mother, and the aftermath was just awful for Lana, as she was still his legal wife. So she's having to deal with all this. The family's in turmoil. They decide not to have a service for him, and Lana just kept his ashes with her in New Orleans, but she put her kids on a plane to go be with Zack's family while she tried to wade through her own rage and grief that she was experiencing. She was struggling with guilt because she had just met him a few weeks ago for dinner and told him they needed to finalize their divorce. And, she was angry. She said Zack had ruined her life and their kids' lives. She couldn't imagine just how they would have even made it through a trial. So she was glad that he took his own life. And then she also said his conscience couldn't have dealt with what he did when he came back to reality. She was broken. She was troubled. She was grief-stricken. I mean, my heart hurt so bad when I read Lana's words and thoughts and what she was experiencing as she dealt with her kids too. I mean, just heartbreak. So what do I think? So not much left, I guess, to discern from this story, but it did devastate me. In no way do I want to diminish what Addie endured in her short few years on this earth, but I do think Zack was suffering from PTSD, and he needed some kind of intervention and care that oftentimes I don't think gets recognized before it's too late. And of course, you couple that with alcohol and drugs and all these other factors, it was just like gas in a match. And I can't imagine Addie, watching the love of her life take hers, and then I can't imagine Zack literally being tortured inside his own head. It's devastating. The whole case is devastating. These children that have to live with this, because there's the internet. They are going to know what happened. Lana, his family. It's just sad and it's heavy. But let's also use this story to keep information out there that if you or someone you love is suffering, please reach out to one of the many resources out there for assistance. There is zero shame in getting help from your mental struggles. We love you and we need you here to be who you are. So please ask for help. So, just thank you guys so much for being here. I know this was hard and heavy, but I love you. And don't forget to click that subscribe button and notification bell so you'll know when I post some new content. And as always, I want you guys to stay safe out there and stay sweet, my cupcakes. I love you and I'll see you next time. Bye.